Hey mental workers, you're listening to the Mental Work Podcast, your companion to early career psychology. I'm your host, Dr. Bronwyn Milkins, and today we are talking about community psychology, where the focus shifts from the individual to the collective. We'll chat about what it is, what community psychs do, the challenges facing community psychology as a discipline, and opportunities to work in community psychology. Here to help us out is our guest, Shane Puxley. Hi, Shane.
Thanks for having me, Bronwyn.
It's such a pleasure to have you on. Shane, could you please tell listeners who you are and what your non-psychology passion is?
Thanks. I need to note that I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited that you're a long-term listener. Thank you for calling in.
Yeah, I've had it recommended to me from peers, so I've dabbled in and out, but it's been a great opportunity to get to know all the different areas you cover. So I'm a community psychology registrar. I'm 2/3 of my way through that process, and I took a healthy 5-year gap between starting that after finishing my degree. I think there was something happened at a market in Wuhan that might have got in the way for a while.
Oh, okay, yes. Yep, that's it.
Look, my non-psych passion, the serious and earnest answer is family. You know, my beautiful partner, Belle, my 2 children, Archie and Matilda. And I can't not mention my best mate, Audrey, my pug. I think that might be a little bit lopsided, that relationship at the moment. I think we were undisputably best friends until Matilda and I spent quite a lot of time at the beach this summer, and I think some jealousy crept in between the pug and I.
How old is Audrey?
She is 4.5.
Oh, what a cutie. And what colour is she?
She's fawn, and she has these little markings around her eyes that look like upside down swans.
What's her personality like?
Oh, quirky. She's full of personality.
I wish I could interview Audrey, really.
Well, I'd invite her in here if she wouldn't have tried to take over the show.
Okay, no, that makes sense.
And look, pugs don't have a lot going for them health-wise, so the fact they have such an endearing personality means that we look out for them and support them maybe from a community lens.
That's fortunate for them.
Yes. So that's my serious and earnest answer, but then I think it's also, I need to talk about how great 2000s indie music is.
What's your favourite?
Oh, look, Arctic Monkeys were the first cab off the rank, but the Strokes are pretty up there.
Classic, good stuff.
That's it. And if any of the listeners are interested, Lizzie Goodman's book, Meet Me in the Bathroom, from a couple of years ago, it's just this stunning oral history of the New York scene. It's in terms of non-psych passion, it's probably the thing I've talked about most often to my friends and family, and they're probably over it now.
Have you seen The Strokes?
You know what? I actually have not seen The Strokes.
Wow.
I've watched some of the deep cuts on YouTube, but I've not been in Julian's presence in person.
Maybe something to aspire to.
Have you?
No, I haven't. But I when I do see bands who I love, so I love, for example, Sufjan Stevens, and I've seen him a few times, and it's just being in the presence of like a god. That's the best I can describe it. It's just really just like, wow, they're so close to me.
I saw the National when they were here.
I saw the National too.
Yeah, wonderful. And I went on my own and stood at the back by myself, and it was a really moving experience to just really be present and to think about the lyrics in a different way than you do when you just heard the same track a million times.
It's so funny. I also saw the National on my own because nobody wanted to see them with me. I feel like National fans, it's like I'm the only National fan amongst all my friends and like my partner, and they're just like, I don't understand this depressing music. And I'm like, it's beautiful.
I ran a group until 8:30 at night, and they were coming on stage at 8:45.
Yeah.
And I bought a ticket last minute off a friend that was offering, another psychologist. So there's a few of us out there that Matt Berninger's cerebral thoughts.
Lovely.
And raced across town and walked into the back as the first chords of the first song were playing and took it all in. It was magical.
Yeah, super cool. No, great stuff. Okay, we could talk about like non-psychology passions all day, but let's go back to community psychology. I said off mic to you that I literally just looked up the statistics for community psych. So I thought, I know that community psych is a small discipline, and I thought I would actually look it up. So according to AHPRA's latest report, which was of December 2023, there are only 51 endorsed community psychologists in Australia and 21 community psychology supervisors, which is so small. So could you please provide us with an overview of what community psychology is? Because listeners may not have even heard of it, and how it differs from other branches of psychology.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we are psychologists. I'm not quite endorsed as a community
Yeah,
psychologist, so hopefully we can have that at 52 by the end of the year.
I hope so.
But first and foremost, we're psychologists. The
Yeah.
first 5 years of our training map almost entirely onto any other stream of psychology. We do a clinic placement. We understand distress in the same way that any other Australian psychologist might. Community psychology is the applied psychology of working with communities and also sections of communities. So it's working with individuals in the context of community when we do individual work. It looks at distress through an ecological lens, so not just what's going on intrapersonally, but also what's happening in that person's network. What's their school experience like? What's their wider community look like? What's the predominant socio-cultural factors happening at that time in that place? It's prevention focused and strengths based. And so ComPsych's overtly political. We don't hide from the challenges of power structures in our culture, and it critically considers empowerment, not just from a notion of us as people that have power in our community. Also, is it up to us to give people power to empower, or is it just, do we need to be better listeners? So it's something that came out of the cultural change in the 1960s, and we're here talking about 2000s indie music, which couldn't exist if it wasn't for the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and these wonderful 60s acts. ComPsych's like that too. This moment of change, the civil rights, the second wave of feminism. ComPsych sort of decided that, well, maybe the predominant Western individualistic way of doing things could be reviewed. Building on the 60s, we had the 70s in Central America and the liberation movement, liberation theology, liberation psychology. And there was a discussion from giants like Martin Barreau, who talked about, is it right for psychology to stay value neutral in times of intense conflict and injustice?
Wow, such a good question for our current times as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's probably worth reflecting, are the predominant norms that we work within, are they universal, or can they be contextual to different communities and knowledge systems?
There's so much that community psychology can give us. And you know what? It's like, I really resonate with everything you're saying. I'm like, this is great stuff. Like, I love this approach. And I guess, like, I'm wondering how you came to this approach.
I was corrupted by social workers.
Well, you know what? Because what I was going to say is, like, this sounds very social work adjacent.
Yeah. And so I was already fair way down the path. I wanted to be a neuropsych. I thought neuropsychology sounded pretty cool. It sounded pretty smart to be a neuropsych.
Yeah, it does.
A small town, and I didn't really understand what university was like. So I made these decisions as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old of what I wanted to do. And I went through the first 4 years, an excellent course guided towards being a neuropsychologist. And my honours year was really hard. And I'm sure many of your listeners are either at that stage now or are coming out of that stage, but it's a really tough year.
It is. Honestly, it was such a tough year. I honestly, it's really, 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 really tough. Yeah, so completely empathise with that.
Yeah, so I had this experience towards the end of that year where I was wondering, well, what do I do next? I knew that it was time to take a short break. And one of my final exams, I was sitting there procrastinating, applying for jobs, and I took a job as a community mental health practitioner working evenings with homeless youth. And I stayed there for a few years, and it really fit my value system, speaking with social workers. But first and foremost, I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to finish what I started, and I love being a psychologist, and that's pretty much all I've ever wanted to do.
Yeah.
And, one of your early episodes, you spoke about your experience where what works for you is focusing on smaller details, and sometimes the big picture's harder to take in.
Yeah.
I think I have the opposite trait.
Oh, interesting.
I quite like looking at the whole and considering all the factors, the causes of the causes. And in those years between my honours years and my master, the 5 years I took off between honours and masters, I went and sat at the back of lecture theatres every year at the APS Careers Expo and just took in what courses are on offer, what fits my interest, what fits my passion. And I just sat up straighter in my chair whenever community psychology was presented. It just felt like a really good fit for my interests and my values.
Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that I think one of the main distinctions between community psych and, say, other areas of psych like clinical psych is for clinical psych, the distress lies within. So the pathology lies within the individual. But for community psych, it's like the distress is, and I'm doing like a circle action, but it's within the systems, and that it's social, it's communal, it's familial, it's not within the individual, it's influenced by these environmental, social factors.
Yeah, well, and it's also a bit of both. So, as I said, first and foremost, we're general psychologists who have then specialised in an area. So, absolutely, there's times when the distress lies within the individual. It might be biochemical.
Yeah, totally.
But I suspect well, I don't want to speak in terms of majorities or absolute concepts, but my view and the view of this field is that there's also relational factors, environmental factors, cultural factors, financial factors. What's the impact of neoliberalism and turning the mental health treatment sector into a marketplace? Like, what impact is that having on people to emphasize their lack of capacity to get funding? These are the bigger questions in terms of what do we do as a culture. And I think about better access changes. I was frustrated like anyone when that 20 sessions went down to 10, but I was also frustrated because that funding could have feasibly been rerouted into prevention efforts. The housing crisis, these big moral questions of our age, well, they are also linked to distress. And if there was a mature public conversation about how we conceptualise distress and how that might have shifted since the Howard era, I think that's also a worthwhile discussion. The Howard era is when Medicare first came in for our discipline. Well, do we still look at it the same, or have we maybe learnt from some of Sir Michael Marmot's research around social determinants of health, and could we start embedding some of those in a really... And I notice here I've gone down a political rabbit hole, and I think that's the remit of community psychologists, to think about the political.
I was interested to know, did you find doing your Masters of Community Psych that you were similarly, and I don't mean the word lefty in a pejorative sense, but were you amongst similarly minded folks?
Oh, I'm an unwashed inner city latte sipping lefty.
Yeah.
And I probably was around people that had similar mindsets. I had this experience, a personal experience at the first community psychology conference I attended, where 5 or 6 years earlier I'd been a furniture removalist, carrying these heavy desks made out of some sort of old beautiful tree up into these old Melbourne University beautiful rooms, old money, old power. And we had a conference there, and I was sitting in the same room where I probably hoiked that desk up a bunch of stairs to get it there. And just hearing everyone's presentations, and I thought, these are my people. That was a really wonderful experience. And it still is.
So you really have that sense of belonging and community amongst community psychologists.
Absolutely. It'd be hypocritical if we didn't, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it kind of would. It would be it'd just be like the insidious underbelly of community psychology. We all hate each other. So, yeah.
Oh, that's for an off the record conversation.
Yeah.
No, there's nothing there. Joking.
Yeah. But that's really awesome that it resonated well with you. And I've done maybe 1 or 2 episodes. One where I've spoken with Sarah about integrating your kind of advocacy identity as a psychologist. And the reason why I've had to do that episode is because I think a lot of psychologists are quite nervous about being political, having advocacy, having things that they're passionate about politically and socially. And I just wonder how you deal with this. Do you feel comfortable integrating the two together?
It's a really good question. And I think it depends on the setting. So I think if I was to be overtly political in a psychotherapy space, I think that's probably pushing my luck in terms of self-disclosure. It's asking the person in front of me to see me with a lens that I think might distract from the work. So I am quite conservative still when it comes to self-disclosure. I think that it's interesting when you look at how different community psychologists curate their social media presence. One of the first images I saw when I was interested in community psychology was a community psychologist sitting in a kayak protesting climate change and wearing activism quite loud and proud as part of their identity as a psychologist. And I look at the Extinction Rebellion psychologist movement in the UK. And so there's some incredibly forthright and brave people that are actively minded in this field. Coming back to your question, I just try to pick the right setting for those discussions. It's about what the client needs from me, not necessarily. But that's my view. I think that those first 5 years of training in a really traditional psychological science setting has still a big part of my practice.
No, totally. That makes sense. So it sounds like you believe that you need to have a rationale for disclosure and keeping that space in therapy focused on the client and their needs.
Yeah. And I suppose that it would depend on the type of work you find yourself drawn to. So maybe that discussion around equity and access is more about the type of work you do holistically rather than a moment-to-moment flag-waving activism experience.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about how you bring yourself to sessions, and we've chatted a little bit about what drew you to community psychology as a practice. Can you tell us a little bit about the placements that you did while studying your master in community psychology? I'm interested in what might differ between community psych placements and other discipline placements.
And look, this might be a little bit of a disappointing answer because I'm not sure it did a whole lot. I think it was the emphasis of what happened in the placement rather than the placement itself. So I did 3 placements, one of them at the university clinic, running groups, individual psychotherapy, like any clinical psychologist would have done as well. I was part of a larger cohort at the Western Bulldogs Football Club in their Sons of the West men's health program. So we had this opportunity to do some preventative work for people that were attending to be part of a wider community, to learn about their health from a holistic lens. That one also included me really doing a deep dive on gender equity principles and working closely with a community psychologist supervisor. And so it wasn't that the placement itself differed from what another psychologist might do. The type of supervision I was receiving took me to a place of considering what we were doing from a community psychology lens. And the other one I did was through a forensic disability service that I was working at the time. And I think that looking at community psychology principles and its interaction with the forensic sector is a really interesting theoretical exercise and can be sometimes a tough practice point to notice the predominant funding models and the type of language and the type of support needs for people that maybe we need larger systemic change in that space, but it feels a little bit outside our scope.
How do you cope with seeing injustices in your work? So what you just described just then, you can see something that might need systemic change. How do you cope emotionally with doing work knowing that there needs to be change in other areas?
Well, particularly at the start of my career, with great difficulty. I'm pretty sensitive. I suspect a lot of us are. We talked earlier about how perhaps looking at the moment-to-moment details is one of your great strengths, and I'd like to think that it's one of my strengths to think about the causes of the causes, but sometimes that takes you to a place of despair and hopelessness. So I think that some of the basics around bringing it back to your sphere of control and influence, and then noticing there's always things that you're going to be concerned about and try to make small changes, whether it's a donation to a not-for-profit or going to a protest on the weekend or having that difficult conversation with your family and friends. Your sphere of influence is limited, and I suppose that's one of the great challenges of this work is best practice might be to pursue a project that has a larger remit and more scope of influence. And there's not always a funding appetite for that or a readiness for that. So on a personal level, with great difficulty and with really good supervision from Monica that I'm working with at the moment in my community psychology registrar program, I think that those sessions every fortnight are quite sustaining when I can bring the messiness and the feelings.
It sounds like supervision does provide a different focus. So I think one thing that I'm potentially picking up is that, for example, I work with a lot of folks from the queer community, and something that might get a sentence in supervision is like, oh, yes, of course, considering the minority stress model. But then we don't discuss and really chat about that and how minority stress might be influencing them. It goes back to, I guess, the sources of distress inside of them. And it sounds like in community psych supervision, you're almost given permission to explore those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our practice in general, I think, and I guess it's not getting stuck in those things we can't control. It's sort of noticing, okay, well, what's going on in the news is having an impact, and then bringing it back to what we can change. And then perhaps community psychology sets that sphere of influence wider than someone who's more intrapersonally focused might.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I'm so glad that you have a supportive supervisor who you can chat about this stuff to. Having that emotional support is incredibly important. I just want to take us to a different question, which is, what do most people get wrong about community psychology? So what's a misconception that people might have about it?
What's that? They might say, what is community psychology? I mean, one of the main misconceptions people have is that they don't know that it exists. I suppose the query that it depends on if it's happening in a professional setting or at a bar is, well, what's the point? We're a discipline, or as a wider psychology discipline, that's changed significantly since Medicare has become part of our practice. And I don't know the stats like you spoke about earlier in terms of the 51 current community psychologists. I wonder what that would have looked like 20 years ago. I wonder what
that's a good question.
Yeah, what would the proportion of psychologists that pursue a clinical training model have looked like if Medicare wasn't a two-tiered system? So there's these sort of factors that are sculpting our discipline. They're sort of external factors in some ways, and so I guess that's where the conversation fairly quickly goes.
So what is that? What's the point?
What's the point? And my point is that, well, to have a counterbalance of community psychology, having a critical lens on psychology as a whole and being curious and having historical context about some of the ills that psychology's either accidentally walked into or probably carelessly walked into around comparing everyone to a certain norm, or some of the more sinister things that occurred at Guantanamo Bay. So community psychology is hopefully a counterbalance for these things, a space to discuss the discipline from a longer lens rather than being in the weeds.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point to having the discipline. But let's talk about the elephant in the room then, which is that the last master's course for community psychology in Australia actually closed last year in 2023. In your opinion, will community psychology just die out in Australia, or is there still a role for community psychologists?
It won't die. I'm really confident in that. It'll evolve. There's no fewer than 6 current working groups working towards what does this look like in the future. I've personally found it tough to get too involved. Unfortunately, the course closed the week my son Archie was born, and his early weeks were more complicated than we might have hoped. Yeah, so I had this experience of getting these emails and seeing the distress and trying to offer the support I could, but these early months of trying to sort of gather our thoughts, where do we want to take this? I haven't been as active as I'd like to be ongoing. I think that we've got some models abroad where community psychology isn't necessarily an endorsed area of practice. We look at the SCRA model in the US, or the British Psychological Society model, where psychologists aren't necessarily trained as community psychologists. They might have an endorsement in another area or be a general psychologist, but then they're part of the college in their professional, they're part of their professional college, so they can practice in a community psychology way rather than necessarily training the whole way through. So we spoke earlier about the community of community psychologists, and we've got plenty of models in our field on how to address large-scale problems like this, and I suspect we'll be using the tools that we've all built to do that. It was interesting. After the 2018 APS conference, I was having a coffee with a community psychologist who was there, and she was stunned just how many psychologists from other areas of practice were presenting topics that historically would have lived within community psychology. These sort of societal-wide things, the Me Too movement, these sort of zeitgeist topics that were occurring at that conference, and that's, 6 years ago now. And so how good's that? Maybe community psychology thrives as a collaborative piece with other interested parties. I think it's remarkable how much more socially aware psychology has become in the past 10 years, and that probably reflects wider society. We've got footballers speaking out on social issues, so why shouldn't psychologists? And I think that it's important that the research, the practice, the oral traditions of community psychology supplement psychology as a whole as we move forward. And so it might not necessarily be that it's hoarding knowledge in one place. I think for your listeners that are interested in community psychology, they might be surprised how many of the journal articles are open source, because it's not a part of the practice. Yeah, well, it's not a part of the practice that would hoard knowledge and put it over here. It's about equity. It's about access. So I think when it comes to changes like this, it's important that we adapt and acknowledge that psychology as a discipline is so much more outward facing than it was when probably both of us started our training, and that's a pretty cool thing.
I think it is pretty cool. It's like, okay, so for what I'm hearing from you is that you don't believe that it will die out, like it will live on. It's lived on for decades, and it will continue to live on through passing down knowledge, and that psychologists are becoming more aware of social factors.
Maybe more emboldened.
Talking about them. Emboldened, that's a good word. Yes, okay, I agree. Yeah. But as you're talking as well, I still feel like, I don't know if you share this feeling, I feel sad that the master's program is closed. I'm like, for me, that represents a massive narrowing of what we value, and I think that's really sad. And I just wondered if you shared that perspective, or maybe have a different framing of it.
I think that I've been through a grief process, like I'm sure my peers have, in terms of, well, that was a really simple, direct, linear way to become a community psychologist. And perhaps there's a hiatus before that option returns, or perhaps it will look different. I'm not sure how it will live on, and whether that's through, like if you think about community psychology as an activist, as a politically driven space, it's maybe living within institutions isn't a super comfortable home. So, I'm really intrigued.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued. I'm more interested on where it goes next rather than sad. I think that I was definitely bummed out initially, but I think, well, there's a bunch of people that are passionate about this topic that are well versed in how to address topics on a large scale, and I'm really interested to see what happens next.
Yeah, that's a really interesting reframe. And as you were saying that, I was thinking that's a really good point. Like, for example, if people want to get trained in narrative therapy, this doesn't sit within an institution necessarily. It sits within an organisation where you can go get narrative therapy training. Same for family therapy, same for psychoanalytic psychotherapy. You can still get into these traditions and practice from those lenses, but it doesn't necessarily fit within a university institution.
Yeah, I would agree. And I as I said, I've been less involved in the discussions to date, and I'm really interested to see where it heads next. It's one of those family seasons where I've had to sort of look after my own first.
No, of course, very understandable. I'm also interested to see where it goes in the future. Yeah, I just think it's so important. Community psychology is so important. It's such a great lens. It's so important for us. Like you said, I feel like your point about offering, I'm going to paraphrase your words. I think it was like offering like a counterpoint or like balancing of other psychology views. Like, that's incredibly important.
Yeah, we don't want groupthink. Let's,
no.
But it's not coming from a place of agitation. I think sometimes it's misinterpreted of, some community psychologists might actually call themselves critical psychologists. Their viewpoint is first and foremost, let's drill down on the discipline and what's working and what's not. Are we skewing towards offering people that can afford it more access to our services than thinking about various knowledge systems and, how can we flatten that power structure? And I think that as a counterbalance, we can offer that, but it's a collaborative counterbalance. I think we can be invited into the tent as well.
Absolutely. Shane, how does community psychology relate to some of society's biggest challenges? So, for example, the ongoing impacts of colonialisation, climate change, cost of living crisis, housing. How does it relate to those?
Great question. And first of all, I'd redirect the listener to look up Community Toolbox. Just Google Community Toolbox, and it's through the University of Kansas. And that's a really great how-to tool when we think about these big issues that feel so outside of our scope and our control. Well, there's been a lot of work done in terms of where to start, and taking that first step's often the hardest. So ComPsych's uniquely placed with these big questions. Gauging the readiness for change is key, and we know that that's important in individual work. We know the stages of change model, Prosker and DiClemente's stages of change model, and thinking about motivational interviewing. And whenever we set our goals too far ahead of where someone's at, we create resistance rather than change. And that's the same on a group level. And so the most influential paper across my practice is Edwards and colleagues from 2000, who look at group readiness. They adopt that individual stages of change model to a group readiness model. And if you think about climate change, the urgency of this issue is mismatched with the community's willingness, or perhaps the corporate or governmental willingness to put those change steps in place. So how do we meet people where they're at? How do we help them to take that next step? And if you look at community psychology's mapping through that Edwards paper, and it's adopted into some great models in that Community Toolbox website, where you can go back and look at the implementation science of where's this problem at? Is there no awareness? Is there some awareness? Have we started some efforts? Are they working or not? I think that's a really interesting place to start, and it's been very useful for my practice.
No, that's wonderful. I love how you're speaking to the how of these societal challenges and bringing that back to psychological models, but applying it to the group. I think that's really awesome, because all psychologists will know about the stages of change model. And it's, been like, okay, why is there this mismatch between the urgency, for example, of climate change and then the apparent lack of action or inaction from government to assist it? Making sense of that psychologically. It's just, it's really, what's the word I'm looking for? I find it quite reassuring. I think that's it. Yeah, like reassuring. I like understanding things. And so I like being able to have a model and a framework for this like huge discrepancy, because I'm like, why? Why would you not do something? It's so urgent.
Well, that's right. Yeah. And if we put that pressure on someone who didn't seem like they were ready to take that pressure on, then they're going to push us away. And if we can, and it's an interesting sort of ethical discussion within the field, because if you look at the Extinction Rebellion psychologist movement in the UK, they're saying, hey, the urgency, we can't necessarily work from an incremental change model. The urgency is here, it's now, it's a climate emergency, and let's protest. And they're saying, let that be known through civic disobedience. And so that's a really interesting sort of pushing our role as activists to the nth degree. And I love that there's people doing that. I wonder about the model of change and just meeting people where they're at. Again, corporations and governments where they're at, and inviting us into the tent and pushing it that one step forwards and creating change in incremental ways like we might in our individual practice.
Do you happen to know if community psychologists work as consultants to government or work in social spheres or social policy?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's often the bread and butter of the work. Often at local government level, it seems. I think it's, when you think about government policy and our influence, I had this experience in early July 2020. I'm in the inner west of Melbourne, and I share a postcode with 6 large public housing blocks, and they were locked down a week or two before the rest of the city was. And there was government messaging around, this is a vertical cruise ship, it's unsafe. And it was very paternalistic about this sort of saviour complex of like, we're going to shut people down. And when you think about the socioeconomic status of those residences and the cross-cultural needs of those residences, perhaps the urgency of COVID and the fear led to such a paternalistic top-down approach. But within a couple of days, we had Margaret Simons, the journalist from The Guardian, speaking with women on the inside who had a leadership role in those communities. They were looked at as the leaders of that community. And once their voices were elevated, it was easier to understand how he could support people. And I think that while that wasn't done from a community psychology lens, it's a great example of community psychologists can help identify who the existing leaders are rather than coming in from an expert model and saying, do this, this, and this. We'll sit there, we'll be, what's the saying about 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth, and use them to that ratio. That's what a community psychologist would try to do, is to just sit tight and identify or support notice the existing leaders in the space, and if we had an ear of government, to say, well, maybe talk to the people on the inside and get their perspective. But a lot of things happened in those months and years that I'm sure if there was a more methodical, slower approach, they'd be done differently. But again, that urgency piece sometimes finds it hard to meet people where they're at.
So if our knowledge is needed, then community psychologists can offer that knowledge which comes from the research base, but they don't necessarily need to stand up and be like, hello, I'm an expert here, expert over here, let me tell you what's up.
Well, that's the thing. That model can, again, not be the right fit. Particularly, I'm someone who's white, straight, have layers of privilege in my life. And if I was to go into a community and take on the expert model, it's likely not the right fit. It's about being present and noticing, well, which voices can be elevated. And I think of Christopher Sonn and Garth Stevens writing on decolonising psychology, and they talk about it from a place of, well, reclaiming the archives, centering marginalised voices, and working in an intersectional way. And that centering of marginalised voices, I think that just because we have a master's degree and a way that we can speak, it doesn't mean that we're the most important voice that needs to be heard. It's actually taking a backseat most of the time and supporting people that have the existing knowledge. And that's that strength-based approach that we try to practice from within.
Yeah, so not assuming that other people are deficient and that you have the right answers to come in, assuming that they have strengths which have helped them survive and continue to survive.
Yeah, and if you think about the literature around disaster recovery, that plays out constantly. The more people, swan in and have a saviour mentality, the more they get told in creative ways where to go.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, it repeats and repeats itself.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm so glad that we have that approach. Do you ever look at other psychologists and you're like, they could do a bit of community psychology lens here? Like, do you ever get judgy? I guess it's a personal question.
No, not really. No, and look, I'm so lucky in my practice that I've always been in multidisciplinary teams. So there's always an ally in the room that's a social worker or a youth worker, or I think that any good multidisciplinary team has those discussions openly. And if there's a psychological safe space, then let's talk about the discrepancies in the why. And my time in the forensic sector, it's definitely worth thinking about how we could look at larger scale change in terms of maybe building less prisons and funding more treatment programs. There's a time and a place to have that discussion. Moment to moment, as I said, the field is shifting, and I think that there's so much more in common with psychologists, whether you're community endorsed or health endorsed or counselling endorsed. There's so much more in common than there is different.
That's what I'm hearing overall. There's a lot of commonalities and overlap, which is great. And then there's also this perspective that community psychology brings, which is so important as well.
we always want to stand on the shoulder of giants. So how do we notice what's gone before? But then that connective piece is still the most useful.
So, Shane, where are you now with your career and where do you see yourself headed in the future?
Now my work week looks like 2 days in a psychotherapy setting in a really community-oriented private practice. It's really great that there's a real connection there. I have an opportunity every month to run a group reflective practice with the other psychologists there, and again, realize in those moments you overt what you think is your own private experience and realize that most people have the same anxieties and interests and fears as the next person. So 2 days in that setting and 3 days in a childhood trauma setting where I do a lot of work in groups. I reflective practice groups for youth workers primarily in out-of-home care, social workers in case management roles, and it's a real opportunity to drill in and out from that ecological lens. I sometimes have a referral from an individual young person that's had some trauma and neglect in their past, and I can do some work with them, but then I'll also work with their family, their residential care placement if they're in out-of-home care, their school, their football club. I think that those 3 days are a real opportunity to use community psychology principles. But if I'm honest with you, Bron, I'm craving long, slow, boring, introverted project work. That's where I want my career to go at some point. I'd love 40 to 50% of my week doing treatment and then an opportunity to really look at some large-scale projects and get lost in the details.
Sounds good to me. Is there any passion projects that you wish you could work on the introverted side of things?
It changes day to day, and I'm in that phase of having 2 small children in the house, and sometimes I dream up projects at 3 a.m. when I'm feeding my boy, and by the time I've gone back to sleep for a couple of hours, I'm not as interested as I was at that time. So I'm just sort of noticing the personal season I'm in, and once everything is a little bit more routine based, I'll start to think about what those large scale projects are. But yeah, I mean, whether that's in sport, whether that's in the out-of-home care sector, whether that's forensic disability, these are things that I've got experience and expertise in, but I don't know is the long and short answer. I just know that I'm learning more about myself from a introversion perspective, and I miss the pandemic aspects of, which I know is a bit, of course it was a terrible time for many people. In my little bubble with my dog and my partner, it was a beautiful time to sort of reset and to read lots of books and to listen to music and make pancakes. And that was a time where I was really productive and switched on and doing client-facing work 5 days a week. I don't think that that's my long-term future.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The pandemic, terrible, did provide an opportunity to be able to reflect on how we are making our days and living our lives and what really matters to us and the kind of people that we would like to be day to day, which is a wonderful opportunity.
And from a community psychology perspective, the vast majority of the first 6 months of that master's is doing self-reflective exercises. You've got to work out who you are and what you care about and your own positionality in relation to others. That's a really crucial part of being a community psychologist. And I think that's probably something I'd recommend to the listeners in terms of whether you're going down a ComPsych path or not, doing some values work and checking in about what's important to you, it makes it a whole lot easier. If I had have kept blindly going down the neuropsych or a clinical psych path, I wouldn't be as fulfilled in my career. I love that work and I have some great colleagues that I learn from every day. It wasn't quite the right fit for me.
No, I would echo that and I completely support that. I did, it's an ongoing process, but I remember a few years ago, and I've still got the documents, but I just started writing a Word doc about, I think I titled it Assumptions I Have About Clients. And I was just dumping like all the things that are important to me, because one of the things that's really important to me is non-hierarchy. And I think that it speaks to me as a neurodivergent person. I just don't recognize hierarchy. And so I wanted to bring that into my practice as well. So for me, it's like I know some things in particular areas which may be of help to my clients, but I do not think that I'm better than them. And that really helped clarify how I relate to my clients. And so the long-term clients that I have had, many of them have commented about how I speak to them as though I truly respect them and their knowledge and their strengths, and that they have not received that from other professionals. And yeah, just the clarity of that self-reflection is really wonderful. So yeah, I would highly recommend that to listeners as well. It's really beneficial.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity just to check in on what you care about. And I suspect a lot of people that struggle to offer that flat power structure are still working out who they are themselves, and sometimes that insecurity can be something that we maybe overcompensate for, and it's certainly something that I try to notice lightly with curiosity.
Absolutely, yeah. Curiosity is always nicer than self-judgment and berating yourself. So, Shane, lastly, is there any other advice you would give to early career psychologists who are interested in practicing from a community psychology lens?
Google the Community Toolbox. Have a look at the APS Community Psychology page. Don't necessarily need to become a member, but have a look at the resources that are available there. Some of the abstracts from conferences and the links to different journal articles. If you're interested in, my professional crush is Professor Isaac Prelintensky from the University of Miami. He was previously an Australian-based community psychologist. He's Argentinian.
Okay, I'm going to ask you how to spell it so I can put it in the show notes.
So it's PRILLELTENSKY.
Okay. Oh, God, he's got some... Is those tattoos? Okay, no, there's just text. Okay. Cool. Former Dean, School of Education, Human Development, former... Okay, yep, cool. Do you have a favourite? Oh, he has lots of books. He's got a community psychology book. Okay, I'll just pop the link to him.
So he's got a great blog. Professor Isaac has a great blog, and he talks about mattering.
Yeah.
And it looks at that theory of mattering from lots of different angles, and the New York Times did an article on it recently. So that's probably a really good access point for people that are interested in community psychology in the real world, and particularly in the workplace. People are happy at work when they feel like they matter, when they feel valued, but more specifically than feeling valued, they want their leaders to know why they're valued. What specific thing do they bring to the team that others might not? If we can offer people that in the workplace, well, that's community psychology in action. And Professor Isaac's blog is excellent, and he's a pretty frequent podcast guest, so you'd be able to find him on your Spotify as well.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing us to him and his work. That'll be really interesting. And I'll put all those links in the show notes. And if listeners want to learn more about you or get in touch, where can they find you?
Google my name. I'm the only Shane Puxley in the world that I'm aware of. So I've got LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm not particularly active, but I'll reply to any messages or connection. There'll be information about how to work with me from an individual therapy perspective, and also just reach out.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Shane, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and learn about community psychology and your reflections on this space and where it's headed in the future. And listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss other episodes, do press follow on your podcast listening app, and that means that you'll get new episodes as they drop. If you loved this episode or any of our previous ones, do leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast app or iTunes or Spotify. It genuinely does help get the podcast into more ears. That's a wrap. Thanks for listening to Mental Work. Have a good one and catch you next time. Bye.